Even the Aboriginal elders that I've talked to still have handed down verbal history of Lemuria.
You know what I find really interesting about stories like this is that it's all about context, right? If you take, for instance, the story of Atlantis away from Plato, then it becomes this technologically advanced alien civilization that has existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? But if you read Plato, then none of that is true. And the same is true for Lemuria, right? It's become this like mystical, old, ancient island off the coast of Australia and Madagascar that sunk. But if you actually read the story of Lemuria or where Lemuria came from, then none of that is true. Hey, my name is Joe. I have bachelor's degrees in archaeology and classics. I am not a practicing or professional archaeologist. I just like to get on social media and talk every now and again. And this isn't to poo-poo Mr. Carson or anybody who believes in this kind of mythological idea. It's just he has a major platform, right? People listen to him, thousands of people listen to him, and he makes money off of people listening to him. And so he kind of has this obligation to keep talking about the things that he's talking about, even if the story isn't true. So I'm going to tell you about where Lemuria came from and why it became so popular today. So in the 1860s, a British zoologist and lawyer by the name of Philip Sclater, he created 6 zoogeographic regions around the world. They're still in use today. He was a known scientist of his time. And during this research, he had discovered that there were lemur bones found in Madagascar and also in southern India, but there were no lemur bones on the African main continent and no lemur bones in the Middle East. And so this led him to the theory of Lemuria, which is where the name comes from, just because of lemur bones found in 2 separate areas of the world. And so he had decided that at one point there was an island or a continent that had connected Madagascar to southern India and also to Australia. Now, this was before the time that plate tectonics were known or Pangea was known. So the idea sounded sound, it sounded scientific. And this theory of Lemuria was accepted scientifically until the early 20th century, the early 1900s, when plate tectonics and continental drift were a newly accepted theory. It proved that there could not have been a continent or an island in the Indian Ocean of that size. It just couldn't happen. But what had happened, and what Sclater wasn't entirely wrong about, was that about 400 million years ago to about 70 million years ago, there was a microcontinent where Madagascar and India were actually connected. And then about 70 million years ago, they split apart. And that is how these bones, these remains, would have ended up from Madagascar to India, but not shown up on the African mainland or throughout the Middle East. And so when all of this new scientific information came to light and scientists began studying it, the idea, the theory of Lemuria as a scientific endeavor was dropped. It was discredited. It wasn't real. It didn't happen. So here is Mauritius before it divided about 70 million years ago. You can see Madagascar and India were connected at some point during that time. And in the 1870s, when Lemuria was still under sort of the scientific acceptance phase, a biologist, Ernest Haeckel, who is German and a zoologist, he kind of theorized or suggested that humanity started in this area, started in Lemuria and kind of moved out from that area, which kind of cemented this idea in occultist mind that Lemuria was real. And so in the late 1800s, occultist and creator of this idea called theosophy, Helena Blavatsky or Madame Blavatsky, created this idea that Lemuria was the ancestral homeland of humans, and she called them Lemurians, and that really like took off and it really got popular in just uh, public arenas. And this is where ideas like Mr. Carson's come from. They all come from stories that like maybe started out in something and then blew up into something completely different, right? Like Lemuria was rooted in a scientific theory and then dropped by the scientific community and picked up in occultist behavior and occultist philosophy and theology, and then it just took off, and now it's public and it's like this ancient mystical idea, when in reality it was nothing more than to describe how one set of bones showed up in another set part of the world without there being this idea of a migration. And so I would almost guarantee that the people that Mr. Carson is talking to are not talking about Lemuria, because Lemuria, the word itself, didn't even exist until the 1860s when the zoologist created it to describe lemur bones getting from one place to another. So I don't know who he's talking to when he says he's talking to these people, but I don't think he's actually telling the truth in this. And like I said at the beginning, Mr. Carson and others like him, they have a financial need to keep the story going, right? Like they have built their careers and their lives around this story. But if you just do some research, it takes maybe like 10, 15 minutes, you can start poking holes in what they're talking about. And their comeback will always be, well, that's accepted theory. That's what the main scientific community wants you to believe, and that's just not real. And the truth is, people are working off of what we see within the world, right? Archaeologists are working with the actual archaeological remains. And yes, there is some theorizing, but most of this is theories that have been proven over time. And it's easy for these people who believe in this to say that, these stories were just lost over time, or these documents were destroyed, or these oral traditions were just forgotten about. But what they're actually doing is just taking huge chunks of history and either deleting it or manipulating it in a way that works for their narrative so that they can keep pushing this idea. But yeah, that's really it. Lemuria as a mystical continent didn't exist. It wasn't even a thought in people's minds until the 1800s, when a lot of this became popular, Atlantis especially. But I hope you enjoyed. I'll put my sources in the end of this video, as I always do. If you have any comments or questions or anything like that, please feel free to leave them there. I will talk to you later. Bye.